Sara's bedroom was eerily silent. The only sound was the soft ticking of a clock on the nightstand, marking time in a space that would never feel the same again. Her body lay motionless on the bed, blood staining the white sheets, a gruesome contrast to the calm, still atmosphere. Her eyes were wide open, staring into nothingness. The shock was frozen on her face, a look of disbelief, like she had never seen it coming. Detective Harris stood over the body, his eyes narrowing with the realization that this wasn't an ordinary crime. "There's no sign of forced entry," he murmured to his partner, Detective Miller, who was quietly scribbling notes. Miller's face was taut with suspicion. Could be someone she knew, someone close. The room smelled sterile, like the faint scent of perfume mixed with iron. Harris squatted down, inspecting the small details. A broken photo frame on the floor, an overturned vase, nothing that seemed to fit. Whoever did this, they knew her well. They didn't need to force their way in. The question loomed in the air like an unanswered prayer. Who could have done this? As the investigation continued, the most perplexing detail began to emerge. There were no witnesses, no sounds, nothing. Neighbors, all within earshot of the house, reported seeing nothing suspicious that night. No screams, no commotion, no sign of an intruder slipping through the front door. Detective Harris spoke with a frown as he paced the living room, his voice low. How does someone just disappear like that? No struggle? No noise? Miller crossed his arms, processing the growing pile of evidence that led nowhere. It's like the killer was invisible. Someone Sara would have trusted. They paused, exchanging a glance. Could this have been someone Sara knew well enough to let in without hesitation? The implications were chilling. Could a stranger be behind this, or was Sara's killer hiding in plain sight? Hours later, an unexpected discovery jolted the case. Miller was the one to find it. A laptop, open and glowing on the desk. It wasn't just any laptop, though. This one belonged to Sara. On the screen, a conversation thread unfolded before them. The words were intimate, laced with longing, and deeply personal. "I can't wait to see you again. You make me feel alive more than anyone ever has." Harris leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is this? An affair?" Miller scanned the messages, his face darkening. Sara had been talking to someone. Someone we didn't know about. His eyes flicked to Harris. "Do you think this could be related to her death?" The message thread revealed an affair so secret, so hidden, that not even Sara's closest family had known about it. The relationship, built on words and promises, had festered in the shadows, hidden from everyone who mattered. Could this be the motive behind the murder? Sara's family arrived at the scene, faces pale and frozen in shock. Her husband, Daniel, stood at the doorway, his lips trembling, eyes searching for answers he was too afraid to ask. "Miller," Harris said, his voice flat, "you better talk to him." Daniel's voice cracked as he turned toward the detectives. What happened to her?" He could barely get the words out, his hands trembling, a father's pain on full display. Next to him, Sara's children, Ella, a teenager, and Max, a young boy, stood still, unable to process the scene before them. Ella, in particular, seemed lost, her eyes scanning the room as if she could will the nightmare to end. "Who could have done this to her? We don't even know who she was anymore," Ella whispered, barely holding back tears. Their grief was palpable, filling the room with an oppressive sadness. But the deeper question lingered in the air. Who was Sara, really? The laptop, left unattended on the desk, became the dark window into Sara's hidden life. The more the detectives read through her conversations, the clearer it became that Sara had been living a life far removed from the one she presented to her family. "I never thought she'd do something like this," Daniel muttered, staring at the screen in disbelief. "I mean, Sarah, my wife, she wouldn't cheat." His voice wavered between anger and confusion. The conversation threads painted a picture of love, passion, and secrecy, with Sara and her online lover sharing deep and emotional words Daniel never knew. The screen revealed a side of Sara her family had never known, one that didn't revolve around her role as a wife and mother, but as someone seeking affection in a place no one could see. The messages grew more intense as the night went on, and it was clear Sarah had been swept away by something or someone that offered her the intimacy she desperately craved. But was it enough to bring about her untimely death? The questions multiplied, with no answers in sight. The investigation had only just begun, but already the implications were far-reaching. Was the man Sarah had been communicating with the person responsible for her death? Could it have been him? A shadowy figure in the online world, driven by jealousy or obsession? Or was the killer someone closer to her? Someone with a motive born of betrayal? Someone who had been watching, waiting, and finally snapped? The truth hung in the air, elusive and tangled in a web of secrecy. Detective Harris closed the laptop, his eyes lingering on the screen before he stood up, letting the weight of the situation sink in. It's too soon to tell, but we're not ruling anyone out. The investigation had opened more questions than answers, and as Sarah's family continued to grieve, the detectives were left with a chilling thought. Could it be that the one person Sara trusted most was the one who ultimately betrayed her? Sara sat alone at the kitchen table, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her coffee cup. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rustle of papers scattered across the countertop. It was a silence she had grown accustomed to, too familiar, too suffocating. At 40, Sara felt the weight of time pressing down on her, especially in her marriage to Tom. Her life had once been filled with the sound of children's laughter. Ella, her independent, sharp-tongued daughter, and Sam, her sensitive, shy son. Now, both children were mostly away. Ella at college, and Sam buried in his teenage world of sports and video games. Tom, too, had retreated into his own existence, a successful businessman whose long hours and emotional detachment left little space for connection. Sara had once been someone's world. But now, as she gazed at her reflection in the kitchen window, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She was still the loving mother, the dutiful wife, but she felt invisible. There was a void inside her that no amount of homemaking or maternal devotion could fill. Tom's briefcase slammed onto the counter as he walked in, barely acknowledging Sara. He was already scanning through his emails, his mind elsewhere. His tired eyes met hers for a moment, but there was no spark, no warmth, just the cold distance of routine. He hadn't noticed the subtle shift in her, how she had become quieter, more withdrawn, how her eyes no longer lit up when he entered a room. "I'll be in the office," he muttered, before disappearing upstairs. Sara stood still, her gaze lingering on the empty doorway. The man she had once loved had become a ghost. She wasn't angry at him. How could she be? He was doing what he had always done, working hard, providing. But what did it all matter when there was no one to share it with? When the bed she climbed into each night was cold, empty of intimacy, of affection. She had tried to talk to him countless times, tried to express the growing loneliness, the desperation that gnawed at her. But Tom hadn't listened. Or maybe he just hadn't cared enough to. Sarah's relationship with her children was complicated, fractured in different ways. Ella, once her confidant, had become distant. It wasn't just the age gap, the new friends, or the fact that she was discovering life outside the family home. It was the resentment that had begun to seep through. Ella viewed her mother's vulnerability as weakness. She didn't understand why Sara clung so desperately to the man who ignored her, or why she couldn't just move on. Sam, on the other hand, was different. At 14, he was too young to fully grasp the emotional distance between his parents. But he noticed the silences, the cold dinners, the lack of smiles. He tried to talk to Sara, to ask her if she was okay, but there was always an air of sadness around her that made him unsure. She'd smile, tell him everything was fine. But Sam wasn't fooled. "Mom, are you sure you're okay?" he'd ask, his small voice full of concern. "I'm fine, sweetie," she would reply, too quickly, brushing a straight hair from her cheek. And so, the walls grew thicker, the isolation deeper. Sarah's heart ached with a longing she couldn't explain. She loved Tom, or at least the version of him she had once known, but that love had become a shadow of itself, slipping through her fingers like sand. She wasn't angry at him anymore, just tired. Tired of being the one who reached out, the one who hoped, the one who cared. It was in the quiet moments, when she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, that the longing for something more surged within her. She had tried everything. Cooking his favorite meals, planning romantic nights, even taking a long walk in the park together. But nothing seemed to spark a change. Then one night, while scrolling mindlessly through her phone, she stumbled upon an ad for a dating site. She hesitated for a long moment before typing in a false name. What harm could it do? She wasn't looking for anything serious, just someone to talk to, someone to listen. His name was David. He was charming, attentive, and most importantly, he listened. Sara found herself opening up to him in a way she hadn't with anyone in years. Her messages to him were full of vulnerability, raw emotions she had long buried. David didn't judge her. He didn't ask for anything, except her time, her words. Their conversations quickly became an escape. Late into the night, Sara would sit in bed, her laptop glowing softly in the dark, exchanging messages with him. Words of affection, of longing, of things she hadn't dared say out loud for so long. One night, as her fingers hovered over the keys, she typed out, "I feel like you really understand me." David's reply came instantly. "I do. I really do. You don't have to feel lonely anymore." She smiled at the screen, feeling something stir deep inside her. Maybe this was the connection she had been craving. Tom remained oblivious to Sarah's growing emotional bond with David. He continued his work as usual, taking late-night calls and spending his weekends at business meetings. He didn't even notice when Sara stopped trying so hard. He didn't see the small changes, how Sara dressed a little more carefully, how she took longer getting ready in the mornings, how she smiled more in her texts to David than in her conversations with him. She no longer looked to Tom for affection. His indifference made it easier to retreat further into the world of David's words, to find solace in the attention she was finally receiving. Tom thought nothing of it. To him, life was just going on, day by day, business as usual. But Sarah's mind had already started to drift into a new world, one that Tom had no place in. It started with a message, a cryptic text that Sara didn't recognize. I know what you're doing. Stop now, or it will end badly. At first, she dismissed it as a joke, but then another came, and another, each one more threatening than the last. He's not who you think he is. You're playing with fire. Sarah's heart raced. She stared at the messages, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. Who could know? Who could be watching? Her mind raced. Was it Tom? Had he discovered her secret? Or was it someone else? Someone from her past? But David's words kept her grounded. He reassured her, told her it was nothing to worry about, that these were just empty threats. And for a while, she believed him. She wanted to. But the unease never truly left her. It only grew, a shadow in the corners of her mind. And as the nights passed, Sara felt the darkness closing in around her. Sarah's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, and for the umpteenth time that evening, she felt her pulse quicken as she saw David's name flashing across the screen. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen. You should answer him. David's message echoed in her mind. He always knew exactly what to say, how to make her feel seen when Tom, her husband of 20 years, barely noticed her at all. The night had become an unspoken routine. Sara would cook dinner, try to engage with Tom, but there was always an unbridgeable distance between them. He'd retreat into his study, working late as he did every night. Meanwhile, Sara, longing for a spark that had long extinguished in the marriage, found herself drawn more to the warmth of the virtual conversations that David promised to fill the void with. Hey, beautiful. David's latest message greeted her, the words warm and welcoming. I know things aren't easy at home, but I'm here for you. I understand you better than anyone else. You're not alone anymore. The words echoed deep inside her. It wasn't just his compliments, but the sense of validation he gave her, something Tom had never seemed to care to do. You're not alone anymore. How many times had she whispered that to herself, wishing she could believe it? Sara's fingers moved as if on their own, typing back. I wish I could just escape from everything, she typed, biting her lip. Escape. The word felt too real. But when she received his reply, it made her heart beat faster. You don't have to escape, Sara. Just let me help you. We'll figure this out. Meet me just once. I promise it will make everything better. Sarah's hand trembled as she set the phone down, the weight of his promise settling heavily on her chest. Across the house, Tom sat at his desk, papers scattered around him, his laptop screen glowing in the dim light of his study. He had noticed it, Sarah's distraction, her distance, but he couldn't put his finger on it. It wasn't just the late nights or the way she turned away when he asked her questions. It was something in her eyes, a void that no amount of work could fill. He had once told her, "We'll get through this, Sara." But over the years, his words had become hollow, and now he was unsure if he was speaking to his wife or just to the idea of her. The tension between them was tangible, hanging thick in the air like fog. But what bothered him more was how Sara seemed to retreat into herself. Every time he tried to talk to her, she'd slip further away, like sand through his fingers. Tom shook his head. Maybe he was just overthinking. After all, Sara had always been the one to manage the house, the kids. Maybe it was just stress, family stress. But deep down, Tom couldn't ignore the growing pit in his stomach. He had started checking her movements, watching her interactions more closely. But he never asked her directly. He wasn't ready for the confrontation, not yet. He grabbed his phone, wanting to text her but then stopped, staring at the blank screen. What could he say? I miss you. The messages from David had become more frequent, more urgent, and each time Sara replied, her guilt and excitement mingled in a way that made her stomach turn. She knew this was wrong. There was no denying it. But every time she closed her eyes, she could almost hear David's soothing voice. We understand each other. He had given her something she thought she'd lost. A piece of herself she wasn't sure she had the strength to reclaim. She still loved Tom. She had to. She had spent so many years with him, built a life together. And yet, every day, that life felt more like a prison. A cold, lonely place where she was invisible, where her laughter, her joy, had been swallowed whole by years of neglect and routine. David had become her escape, but now she was growing dependent on him. Each text, each conversation made her crave more. How did it get to this point? She wondered. And yet, when she thought about meeting him, when she thought about the possibility of starting over, of being wanted, truly wanted for the first time in years, her heart pounded. Her mind raced. But Tom still didn't know. Sara caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror once, tired, worn, but also full of hope. Could one meeting with David really be enough to undo all that had been built with Tom? Could she risk everything for a moment of passion, of attention that was so desperately needed? Ella had always been the perceptive one, a trait that often felt like a curse rather than a gift. She had always noticed things, especially the subtle shifts in her mother's mood. The way Sara seemed to smile less, or the way she spent more time in her room, hiding behind the screen of her phone. It was the phone that gave it all away. Ella had walked into the kitchen that afternoon, just as Sara stepped out to take a call. She saw the phone on the counter, its screen unlocked. Without thinking, she grabbed it. What she found made her heart sink. Messages. Countless messages from someone named David. The kind of messages that Sara would never share with anyone. Romantic, intimate, personal. Sara's words on the screen weren't just the innocent messages of a woman seeking companionship. No, there was something more, something darker buried underneath. Ella felt a sickening wave of disgust wash over her. How could Mom do this? And yet, as she read further, she saw the cracks in her mother's facade, the vulnerability, the loneliness. Wasn't she just like Ella, desperately searching for some kind of validation? But that didn't make it okay. Ella turned the phone over in her hands, as if hoping the messages would disappear. But they didn't. They were real, and they were a betrayal. She tucked the phone back where it had been, her mind racing. Should I tell Dad? Should I confront her? But there was more. Something else gnawed at Ella. Something darker. She didn't know what it was yet, but she felt it in the pit of her stomach. This wasn't just an affair. Something was wrong, something dangerous. David's messages had grown increasingly demanding. He no longer just played the role of the romantic confidant. He was something more now. A shadow in Sara's life that stretched long into every thought. Sara's life that stretched long into every thought. The tone of his texts had changed. If you don't meet me soon, Sara, things might get complicated. His latest message read, "You've been leading me on for too long. Don't make me do something we'll both regret." Her pulse raced as she stared at the words. Was this a threat? Or just another form of manipulation? Sara couldn't tell. The line between romance and control had blurred beyond recognition. She had seen David's darker side in his messages before. But this felt like something else. Something dangerous. and it was clear that David had no intentions of letting her go. If she didn't meet him, would he hurt Tom? Would he hurt her? The cracks in the facade of the family were starting to show. At dinner, Sara stared blankly at her plate, barely tasting the food. Tom's words floated around her, but they didn't reach her. Ella and Sam ate in silence, their eyes darting between each other, between Sara and their father. The family was no longer whole. It was a fractured thing, and Sara felt every single piece of it falling apart. "Something's not right, Sara," Tom said, suddenly, his voice low and accusing. "You've been so distant lately. What's going on? Why are you shutting me out?" Sara felt her breath catch. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. How could she tell him? How could she admit that the emotional bridge between them had collapsed, that she had found comfort in someone else's arms? "I'm not shutting you out, Tom," she said softly, but the words didn't sound convincing, not even to her. Ella stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You're always shutting us out," she snapped, before storming off to her room. Tom's gaze lingered on Sara, his eyes full of hurt and confusion. But all Sara could feel was the weight of David's demands pressing down on her chest. Everything was slipping away. Sara sat at the edge of her bed, the glow of her phone screen casting a soft, cold light on her face. David's words echoed in her mind, each message dripping with promise and allure. He had become her lifeline, the one person who made her feel seen, wanted. Something she hadn't felt in years. Every text, every call had built up to this moment, a crossroads where there was no turning back. Her fingers trembled as she typed the final message to David. "I'll meet you tonight." At the hotel. There was no hesitation this time, no inner voice trying to talk her out of it. The excitement coursing through her veins was accompanied by a pang of fear, a fear she was too tired to acknowledge. For the first time in ages, she felt free, as if stepping out of the prison she had been living in. But was it freedom, or just another form of entrapment? Sara's heart pounded as she entered the dimly lit hotel room, the door creaking behind her. She hesitated, scanning the space for David's familiar, reassuring face, but found only shadows. The air felt thick, suffocating. The usual warmth she had imagined was absent. A faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting an unsettling pallor to everything. The bed was neatly made, the floor spotless, but something about the stillness made her skin crawl. "David," she called, her voice trembling, though she couldn't tell if it was from excitement or anxiety. There was no answer. She waited, her breath shallow, but still no movement. Maybe he's just running late, she thought, but doubt crept in. She felt the walls close in around her. The room no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a trap she had willingly walked into. Before Sara could gather her thoughts, the sound of a door creaking open broke the silence. A figure stepped out of the shadows, but it was not David. Sara froze. This wasn't the charming man she had built up in her mind. The man standing before her was cold, his eyes empty of warmth. David's smile was gone, replaced by a predatory gleam. "Surprised?" His voice was low, cold and dangerous. Her breath hitched in her throat as realization hit her like a physical blow. "I thought you were different," she whispered, backing away slowly. "I thought you cared about me." David's lips curled into a cruel smile. "I do care about you, Sara. In fact, I care so much that I've waited this long for you. But not for love. No, it's control. You were never meant to escape your life. You're mine now." Before she could react, his hand shot out, grabbing her by the wrist, pulling her toward him with a strength she hadn't expected. Her pulse raced as panic gripped her, but it was too late. He had planned this all along. Sara fought, her nails scraping against his hand, her legs kicking, but it was useless. David was too strong. His grip tightened, and she could feel his breath on her neck, rancid with intent. "Let me go," she screamed, struggling in his hold. "You never understood," he hissed. "You thought I was here for you, but I've been here for the power. And now, you'll see how far I'm willing to go, to keep you." Her mind raced. The door was locked. There were no windows. She was trapped, a bird in a cage. "I never meant for this to happen," she sobbed, pushing against his chest with all her might. David just chuckled darkly, the sound echoing in her ears. "You thought you could play with fire and not get burned?" Sara's world turned to black as he slammed her head against the wall with brutal force. Her body crumpled to the floor, unable to fight anymore. The last thing she saw was his face, contorted with something far more sinister than she had ever imagined. Back at home, Tom couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over him. Hours had passed since Sara left, and there was still no word. He texted her, called her, but there was nothing, just silence. As he paced the living room, a glint of something caught his eye, a small, cracked piece of plastic. Sara's phone lay on the floor, shattered. He bent down to pick it up, his fingers brushing the screen. A single message flashed on the cracked display. "She's mine now." The words hit him like a ton of bricks. His heart sank into his stomach. The pain of realization clawed at him, but the fear that followed it was worse. The truth was unbearable. She had been cheating on me, and now she was gone. Tom's hands trembled as he collapsed into the nearest chair. His mind raced, images of Sara and David flooding his thoughts. His stomach churned. He had never seen it coming. Not like this. Not this dark. Ella hadn't seen her mother all evening, but something told her something was wrong. She had watched the distance grow between her parents, witnessed Sara's secretive behavior. Ella knew something was off, but this was more than she could have imagined. Her instincts led her to Sara's phone. She unlocked it, scrolling through the messages. When she read David's cruel words, the blood drained from her face. "She's mine now." Panic seized her chest as she grabbed her coat and ran out of the house. She had to find her mother. She had to know where she was. The hotel was not far. As Ella entered, the heaviness in the air was palpable. She made her way up to the room, her breath ragged in her chest. Something told her she wasn't going to like what she found. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw Sara's body on the floor. She rushed forward, kneeling beside her mother's lifeless form, her hands trembling as she touched her cold skin. A sickening sense of betrayal washed over her as she stared into her mother's vacant eyes. Ella's chest tightened with grief, but beneath it lay a tidal wave of rage and confusion. Why didn't she listen? Why didn't she see what was happening? The weight of the truth crashed down on her, and Ella felt the world around her slip away. Her mother's secret life had torn their family apart, and now she was left to pick up the pieces. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Mom, what have you done?" The police had hoped for a quick resolution, but the trail quickly turned cold. David had vanished. Every attempt to locate him met with dead ends. The authorities scoured Sara's home, her social media, and her phone, piecing together fragments of her life that had remained hidden for so long. Detective Martinez sat in the dimly lit evidence room, flipping through a stack of Sara's online messages with David. The text exchanges painted a picture of manipulation, a steady, almost surgical approach to breaking down Sara's defenses. "You deserve more than he can give you," David had written. "I'm the one who understands you, not him." It was clear now that David hadn't just seduced Sara. He had isolated her, slowly and methodically pulling her into his control. "This isn't just an affair," Martinez muttered to his partner, staring at the screen. "This is psychological warfare." The investigators were stunned by the depth of David's influence. The affair had been just the beginning. Sara's tragedy, her ultimate betrayal, and her death were not random acts. They were the result of months of mind games, manipulation, and deceit. As the officers continued their search for the missing David, they knew they were only scratching the surface of something far more sinister. Tom sat alone in the living room, his fingers running through his hair as he replayed every moment, every conversation with Sara. He had never truly listened to her, not the way he should have. The house, once filled with the warmth of their shared life, now felt suffocating. "I should have seen it," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I should have seen that something was wrong." The guilt gnawed at him relentlessly. He had been so wrapped up in his own world, so oblivious to the cracks in their relationship, that he had pushed Sara away. She tried to reach him, but instead of providing comfort, he'd been distant, indifferent. And now she was gone. Tom's mind drifted back to the last few months. He had been so caught up in work, in the pressures of life, that he had neglected the most important part of it, his marriage. Maybe if I'd just been there, if I had paid attention. His words faded into the silence of the empty house, leaving only the sharp sting of regret. Could he have done something differently to save her? Could he have prevented the affair? Or worse, her death? Ella paced through the hallways, the weight of grief too much to bear. Anger boiled in her chest, anger at her mother for keeping secrets, for choosing a man like David over her family, and anger at herself for never noticing the distance growing between her parents. She had seen the signs, or so she thought, but never enough to stop it. Not enough to stop her mother's betrayal or to keep her safe. She caught a glimpse of her father sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. His eyes were bloodshot, the lines on his face deepening by the day. But Ella could hardly look at him now. They had been so close, yet now he felt like a stranger. "You're not even angry," she said to him one evening, her voice a mix of hurt and rage. "You just sit there. How can you be so calm about this?" Tom didn't answer right away. His lips trembled as he gazed at his daughter, guilt written all over his face. "I don't know what to say, Ella." Ella shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Say that you should have done something. Say you saw what was happening." But he said nothing. His silence only deepened the chasm between them. The mother she had loved was gone, and all that remained were the fractured pieces of a broken family. Despite the investigation's mounting pressure, David remained elusive. Days turned into weeks, and still, no one had seen him. The police combed through every lead, chasing down every possible clue, but each lead led to nothing. David had slipped through their fingers like smoke. The case was starting to weigh heavily on everyone involved. "This guy's good," Detective Martinez said, shaking his head as he stared at the empty streets on his monitor. Too good. David's absence was like a shadow, hanging over every investigation meeting, every search. The lack of closure made it worse. Sara's family had no answers, no sense of justice, and the question lingered like a cloud in the sky. What had David truly wanted? What was his endgame? And more importantly, why hadn't they caught him yet? Martinez leaned back in his chair. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more it turned into a haunting reminder of Sara's life, her affair, her betrayal, and the man who had destroyed everything. As time passed, it became clear that David would remain a fugitive. With each passing day, the investigation lost steam. The police had no new leads, no new evidence, just the haunting memory of Sara's tragic end. No one could bring her back, and the family was left to live in the shadow of her betrayal. Tom and Ella spent their days in a fog of grief. Their once peaceful home had turned into a house of sorrow, filled with questions that would never have answers. Could they ever find peace? Or would they forever be trapped in the void left behind by Sara's choices? The deeper they searched for answers, the more elusive they became. The case became an unsolved mystery, a crime without closure. Every night, Tom would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering where David was, what he was doing, and what had led him to destroy their lives. But deep down, Tom knew some answers would never come. And even if David was caught, it wouldn't bring Sara back. Ella stood at the edge of the world her mother had built, one of lies and deceit, and wondered if justice could ever be truly served. Could they ever get past the betrayal, the pain, and the broken family? Or was it all just a hollow shell, a reminder that some tragedies were too deep to heal? The lingering question hung in the air like a shadow, waiting for an answer that might never come. Sara sat at the kitchen table, her fingers idly scrolling through her phone as the hum of the dishwasher filled the empty air. Her marriage had been drifting for years, the spark long extinguished by routine and exhaustion. Tom, her husband, had become a distant figure, his once passionate affection replaced by silence. In the void, she sought something, anything, outside the confines of her lonely home. It started innocently enough, a message from someone who seemed to understand her frustrations, a stranger who appeared eager to offer the companionship she craved. David's words were easy to trust, his attentiveness soothing her deep loneliness. He spoke of love, of understanding, of a world where she wasn't invisible. "I see you, Sara," he had said in one of their first conversations. "You deserve so much more than what you're getting. You're beautiful, and you're worth so much more." Her heart, starved for affection, took the bait without hesitation. What began as an innocent escape, a safe harbor from the emotional storm at home, soon escalated. He understood her in ways Tom no longer did. The texts became more frequent, the words more intimate. The anonymity of it all gave her a sense of power, but also a creeping fear. What started as a flirtation turned into something deeper, more dangerous. Sara found herself addicted to David's praise, to the way he made her feel alive again. She didn't realize it yet, but she was already losing herself in the illusion of a perfect love built on lies. As the days turned into weeks, David's words grew sharper, more commanding. He fed her insecurities, manipulated her vulnerabilities with a skill she hadn't even recognized at first. "I can't stop thinking about you, Sara," David would text late into the night, as Tom snored beside her, oblivious to her internal battles. "You make me feel like I'm the only one who truly gets you." You're not meant for this boring, empty life. Come to me, and we'll make it all better. Sarah's internal defenses, already eroded by years of emotional neglect, crumbled under his constant barrage. She needed this. She needed him. David made her feel seen in ways Tom hadn't in years. His affection was intoxicating, drawing her into a world where she was the center of someone's universe. But with each passing day, she felt the tug of guilt, the awareness that she was betraying the vows she once held sacred. Her life with Tom, the husband who had once been her world, now felt like a distant memory. She began to drift further from him emotionally, retreating into the fantasy world David had carefully woven for her. Every touch of David's words, every promise was an escape, one she was willing to pay any price for. "Why don't you leave him, Sara?" David asked one evening, his voice a mix of sweetness and manipulation. "Come live with me. We'll start over, and you'll never have to feel lonely again." The lines between fantasy and reality blurred, and Sara, desperate for validation, found herself slipping further into his control. The double life was starting to wear on Sara, but she couldn't stop herself. She had become addicted to the way David made her feel, wanted, desired, seen. But as she tried to carry on with her normal life, she couldn't shake the weight of her actions. Every time Tom touched her, she flinched inwardly, thinking of the lies she'd woven. Every meal they shared, every conversation felt like a performance. She would sit at her desk, pretending to work, her mind drifting to David. A text message would ping, and her heart would race. But the excitement would quickly turn to guilt. How could she betray her family like this? How could she do this to Tom, who, despite his shortcomings, still loved her in his own way? The shame ate at her, but so did the thrill of secrecy. "I'm sorry," she whispered to herself one evening as she stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, guilt drowning her features. "I'm sorry for what I've become." But her desire for David, his promises of a life filled with passion and purpose, kept pulling her back in, making it impossible to break free from the downward spiral she had created. The fallout was inevitable. The affair, once a whisper in the dark, had now taken center stage. Sara's choices, driven by her emotional vulnerabilities, had set in motion a series of events that would leave her family shattered beyond repair. Tom, upon discovering the affair, felt a mixture of betrayal and helplessness. How had he missed it? How had he allowed his wife to slip away into the arms of another man? And what about Ella, their daughter, who had adored Sara unconditionally? The trust had been broken in every way possible. Sara had tried to end the affair before it escalated further, but by then, it was too late. David's hold over her was far stronger than she could have ever imagined. The lies had grown too thick, the manipulation too deep. And then, the final, irreversible tragedy unfolded. In the heat of the moment, under the weight of her own emotional collapse, Sara made the decision to meet David. It was there, in the final confrontation, where everything spiraled. As her body lay cold, the consequences of her choices spread like a ripple through the lives of everyone she loved. Tom was left to pick up the shattered pieces of their family, and Ella was left to question what kind of world her mother had lived in, a world of lies and broken promises. Tom stood at the window, staring into the empty night. His thoughts were consumed with one question. How had it all come to this? He had failed Sara in every way possible. His emotional neglect, his inability to connect with her, it had all led to this moment of irreversible loss. And Ella, his daughter, was no better off. Her anger towards Sara burned hot, but beneath it lay a deep sorrow. She couldn't understand how her mother had chosen to leave them, how she had let herself fall into the arms of a man who wasn't worthy of her love. In the end, there were no easy answers, no neatly tied up resolution. The consequences of Sara's choices lingered, a shadow that would never lift. Could she ever have escaped them? Could she have outrun the pain of betrayal? David, meanwhile, was nowhere to be found. His disappearance left a trail of unanswered questions. Did he truly love Sara, or had she simply been a pawn in his manipulative game? The haunting question echoed in Tom's mind. Could they ever find justice? Or was it all just a bitter reminder of how easily lives could unravel in the search for validation and affection? In the silence of the house, the questions hung heavy. There was no escape from the past, only the pain of it, echoing louder with each passing day. And as Tom and Ella tried to rebuild their broken lives, the question remained: could they ever find peace? Or were they forever trapped by the choices made in the dark?